Hello, Tungsten Miner here. We are on to part 2 of this Mod Spotlight series on Create. Today, I'll be talking about generating power. Go through all the different ways in which you can generate power, and to actually explore just a little bit about what do we mean by power. Let's jump right in. Okay, to start part 2, the first thing I want to do is actually grab some engineer's goggles. These allow you to see all sorts of things that are not normally visible. In particular, they allow you to see the speed level and stress capacity and impact of various things, and that will become very important in just a moment. So I'm going to grab these out of the chest, and I'm going to just pop them on my face. And right now we can't see anything, but we will in just a moment when we get to some of the machines. Okay, starting off, we're going to talk about these two sources of rotational energy. Manual sources, as it turns out, but we're also going to talk about stress and speed. So here I've got a copper valve handle, which I can right click, and you can see it gives things a quarter turn every time I do that. You can notice that this speedometer kind of punches up just a teeny bit as I turn this thing. It turns out that rotational speed is kind of topping out, I think at 4 or 8, I forget exactly. But you can also see the generator stats there. That kinetic stress capacity is 128 SU stress units at current speed. Every machine that you're going to try and spin or turn or activate is going to require a certain stress capacity, and it's going to use up part of that stress capacity. So if I'm using one of these valve handles, I can only activate a machine which requires 128 or less stress capacity. Here I'm using a hand crank, and you can see it not only goes a bit faster, but it generates a fair bit more stress capacity. So our least powerful option in the game is one of these valve handles, and one step up from that is the hand crank. And of course you can tell I have to click, click, click to keep this going. So not really viable option for automated machines, but it's a really cheap way to get started if you just want to process a few things in your early stage setups. To talk about this capacity in a bit more detail, let's take a look at this guy. Kinetic stress stats 0 at the moment, but I happen to know that it requires 256 to operate, which means, of course, that this thing is going to generate just enough. So as I spin this crank, 256 stress capacity at maximum. You can see the gauge over there. That's as much as it can do in this little network that I've got set up. But it was enough to activate this mechanical press and flatten out this piece of copper. So we've got a copper sheet. Over here, I've got 2 of them lined up in a row, and we can see the, there you go. You can see the shaft kind of sticking out a bit. So this second one is connected to this first one, which means I have a total of 512 stress units required for this network to activate everything. And this crank doesn't do it. It gives me 256. That's it. So as I try to turn it, it's giving me this very helpful message saying, hey, this isn't going to work. We're overstressed right now. Now you notice a bunch of these things say at the current speed. We'll get into that in the next video as we talk about transmitting power around. But at a given speed, it takes a certain amount of stress units, but if you were to have the speed, you double your stress capability and vice versa. So as we talk about stepping up and stepping down speeds of rotating shafts, we can see we could generate enough stress capacity to turn these things, but at a slower speed. So these copper ingots remain unpressed because we didn't have enough power, stress capacity, stress units, in the system to be able to activate those 2. So as we get into other things, we'll have to bear in mind different machines, different sources of power give us rotational speed, and they give us stress units. Okay, here we are looking at the first of several automated ways of getting yourself some power. This is the water wheel. So we can see I've got this in a little box here to keep the water from spilling out. But basically, I stuck a water wheel in there, and as we go around the back, we can see this blue corresponds to where I have a single water source block. And then the important bit is these green blocks show the 3 places where there's a flowing water block that is in contact, with one of the sides of the water wheel. That's what matters. Flowing water blocks in contact with one of the 4 sides of the water wheel. Now you can see the water wheel is turned so that the blades are angled so that they would catch on to the water as much as possible, that gives you the most power. So here I've got a rotational speed of 16, and I've got a remaining stress capacity of 256. That is, I can spin something which requires that much power, which is to say one of those pressing machines, for example. This little object here and this one here are both gearboxes. They allow you to change the direction of rotation 90 degrees. So I've got one shaft that's coming out from the wheel, comes through here. You can imagine there's some complicated bits of gears and things going on inside. Turns this shaft, turns this one, and then turns the power to both of these guys. If I take this wrench, for example, and I fly up here and I give that guy a whack twice, you can see that I've turned it around. So it's not catching the water as well. It's getting spun, but it's not catching it so well. And we can see my rotation has gone down to 10 RPM, and my network stress has gone down to 160. So if you find that you're not getting the full capacity you're expecting, it's probably because your water wheel is facing the wrong way around. Okay, next up, we have an encased fan. So on the underside here, which poor planning on my part, you really can't see it too well, there's a fan blade, and then at the top here we see there's a shaft coming out. If you apply a redstone signal, which I've done with my little lever here, it will detect, it'll react to anything hot underneath it. So I've chosen to use a bit of netherrack on the floor there, and then I set it on fire. But this could be a lava block. I imagine there's a few other things that get hot. Use your imagination. That could power this thing. This will generate 64 SU at the current speed, which is 4 RPM. So not a lot of power and not a lot of speed. So this is not a whole lot going on. But this thing is pretty cheap. It's very small to set up. Pretty easy way to get yourself a little bit of power. And as we'll see in the next video, there are ways of connecting many sources of power to the same shaft, and that allows you to get a lot more power in the end, wherever it is you're trying to direct this. So if we had 4 of these together, we'd be able to power that press, for example. So here we have a larger kind of windmill. This is actually our first contraption. So anything that is considered multiple blocks that are joined together to move around are considered a contraption in Create. So here we have a windmill bearing, and that face that we can see there is allowed to connect to some arbitrary set of blocks, which it's then going to try and pull together and make into a mobile contraption. In this case, I have added a bunch of sails, and we'll just take a look at those. These guys, these white sails, are made out of sail frames, which are just sticks around some andesite. And then you do that around some wool, and you can get 8 of those. So that's enough to get you a little bit of motion, a little bit of power. As you can see, it's very, very slow, 1 RPM with this configuration, and pretty darn powerful, though. So not fast, but very strong. As you add more sails to your contraption, it gets stronger. So you can turn this thing on and off by right-clicking. And so I've just right-clicked it, stopped the whole thing, and now it's broken down into just basic blocks. So if I give myself some more sails, and let's say I put one here, and I put one there, put one there, and put one there, I might have enough to get myself a bit more power. Yeah, so I do. So I've got 2 RPM, and I've got twice as much stress units. So as I keep playing around with this thing, I could make this bigger and bigger and produce more and more power. Now, it's never going to get to be like fast, but it is pretty powerful. And as I'll talk about in the next video, we can step up a lot of power to go faster at a lower power in order to be able to run various kinds of machines at the speed that they require. Again, this is pretty cheap, pretty easy to make, just requires you to build out some sails and set those things up. Pretty good early game source of getting yourself some power, which is infinitely renewable, as it turns out. And our final source of power is the furnace engine. So this is looks a little complicated. It's actually pretty straightforward. I made one furnace engine, that's this guy right here. I made one flywheel, that's this guy right here, and those are both individual single blocks. So that's the one block there, that's the one block there. When I put this thing down next to a furnace, it added this cap, this visual kind of change. Not any block that I needed to make. I didn't have to do anything myself. I just plopped this one block down and it just did all this on its own. Same deal. When I put the flywheel in front of this, leaving a one space gap right there, it added in all of these pistons and camshafts and connectors and whatever else. I didn't have to do anything myself to create those. I just added this one flywheel block and there we go. So what are we looking at here? Well, this is just a furnace. And so long as the furnace is burning, it will produce power in the furnace engine, which will drive the flywheel. But as you can see, it's just about run out of juice. And so when this final bit of flame dies out in the furnace, this whole thing is going to come to a stop. And there it goes. So now we can see the flywheel slowly comes to a halt, and we are no longer generating power at all. So it's important to note, having fuel is not sufficient. You need to be burning something in order for this to work. Could be anything at all. So I'm going to toss some sand in there, make some more glass, and right away, we're back in business. You can also replace the furnace with a blast furnace. That has the effect of being twice as effective. This wheel will turn twice as fast. You'll get twice as much power out of it. You can also see that we're turning pretty fast, 16 RPM, which is great, and we have a tremendous amount of stress capacity. This is a really nice setup if you have a lot of demands to be able to run. Of course, automating the feeding of source material to burn and fuel to burn with is a little bit tricky. But you can well imagine a system where you're using hoppers or whatever else to be able to dump in, let's say, logs at the top. You extract the charcoal out of here, and then you feed it right back in as the fuel. So basically, a supply of wood will get you a pretty effective source of not quite infinite power, but one that should last you a good long while. And that's it. There's actually not a ton of sources of power in the game. So we talked about our hand cranks, we talked about our handle valves, talked about let's see what else was on our list here. We talked about the water meal, we talked about the enclosed fan, our windmill, and finally our furnace engine. And that's it for sources of power. We also talked a bit about the stress and speed trade-offs, which we will explore more in the next video about moving power around. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and hit the button down below. And if you want to see more content like this, go ahead and hit subscribe. Talk to you later.